You're not the kind of woman men wait for in a place like this." The sentence landed on Claire Bennett's chest harder than the winter wind she had fought all the way down Michigan Avenue, and for one suspended second, even the clink of silverware seemed to go quiet around her. She stood beside a table dressed in white linen and candlelight, one hand still wrapped around the strap of her worn brown purse, the other brushing the side of a navy dress she had ironed twice in her studio apartment because she wanted, just for one night, to look like a woman life had not been arguing with. She did not need to look rich. She did not need to look dazzling. She only wanted to look composed, like someone who belonged anywhere she chose to sit, like someone whose life had not lately been reduced to balancing unpaid bills against pride. The man across from her, Daniel, had not bothered to stand. He leaned back in his chair, expensive watch catching the light, lips curved in the kind of smile that asked the room to join in before the joke was even finished. His confidence had the polished ease of someone who had never once mistaken comfort for luck. Even now, with his cufflinks glinting and his bourbon in hand, he seemed less interested in her than in the performance of being disappointed by her. "My sister said you worked in the arts," he went on, glancing at her shoes, then at her purse, then back up with polished cruelty. "I just didn't realize that meant barely hanging on." A couple at the next table pretended not to listen. A server froze for half a breath, then kept walking. Somewhere behind Claire, soft jazz moved through the room from hidden speakers, and somehow that made it worse. The whole place was dressed in taste and money and carefully trained indifference. A room built to flatter people who already believed they belonged there. Claire felt the heat rise to her cheeks, the old familiar heat of being measured, discounted, and explained by people who had never once asked who she was before deciding what she was worth. She hated how quickly the body remembered shame. It reached her before thought did. It warmed her face, tightened her throat, made even the act of standing still feel suddenly precarious. She could have lied. She could have smiled and said she managed a gallery instead of admitting her hours had been cut, or that she was one late rent payment away from losing the apartment she had spent 3 years trying to make feel like a home. She could have made freelance lettering sound like brand consultancy. She could have joked in the self-deprecating way women often learn to joke when truth made wealth uncomfortable. But Claire had run out of energy for pretending rich people were the only ones allowed to have dignity. So she lifted her chin and said, quietly, "Then this was probably a waste of your evening." She reached for the menu, meaning to set it down carefully, leave gracefully, and cry later where no one could see her. That was when Daniel laughed under his breath and said, "Honestly, I knew the second I saw you walk in." The cruelty of that sentence did not just come from what it implied. It came from the timing. It recast the whole evening. Every polite smile, every question, every moment he had let her answer as if she were being considered rather than quietly judged. Across the room, a man seated alone near the window looked up from his untouched bourbon. Ethan Cole had been in the restaurant for 20 minutes, long enough for 2 calls from New York, 1 ignored text from his chief of staff, and exactly 0 peace. He was used to people staring at him when they recognized him, used to curated conversations, polished handshakes, strategic smiles. He was used to rooms treating him like gravity, used to the choreography of high-end spaces where deference arrived before sincerity did. What he was not used to was the sound of someone trying not to fall apart in public. His gaze moved from Daniel's smug expression to the woman standing beside the table, and something about the way she held herself, fragile but unbroken, made his pulse catch. It was in the set of her shoulders, the way she did not hunch, the way her humiliation had not yet broken into apology, the way her face tried so hard to stay composed that it became impossible not to see the cost of it. Then he saw it, half visible inside her purse, the corner of a scuffed blue sketchbook and a yellow pencil tucked along the spine. Memory. Struck fast, sharp, and impossible. A classroom. Beige walls. Late afternoon light over scratched desks. A pencil placed beside his hand when he had needed it most and would never have asked. Ethan set his glass down, rose from his chair, and crossed the room just as Claire turned to leave. He placed a folded bill on Daniel's table, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "She won't be paying for humiliation tonight." Claire stopped so abruptly that the room seemed to tilt around her. Daniel opened his mouth, ready with one more clever remark, but Ethan did not give him the space. He stood calm and straight in a charcoal coat that looked simple until the light caught the stitching, one hand resting lightly on the back of Claire's chair, as if he had every right in the world to be there. "You should leave," Daniel said, forcing a laugh that sounded thinner now, weaker under the sudden attention of half the dining room. Ethan did not even look at him right away. His eyes stayed on Claire, steady and unreadable, as if he were asking a question without making her answer in front of strangers. "Are you ready to go?" he asked. His voice was low, controlled, and somehow gentler than anything she had heard all night. Claire blinked, still holding her purse strap, still trying to understand why a stranger would step into a moment most people would have scrolled past in real life and called unfortunate. "I do not know you," she whispered. Something flickered in Ethan's expression, not hurt exactly, but recognition delayed. "Not yet," he said. Then he turned to Daniel at last, and the temperature at the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. A man who needs an audience to feel tall usually is not. Daniel flushed deep red. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Ethan reached into his wallet, set another bill beside the first, and answered with almost careless politeness. "Someone asking the staff to put dinner on me and your manners on record." A server nearby lowered his eyes to hide a smile. Claire should have felt mortified. Instead, for the first time that night, the shame was no longer hers to carry. That shift moved through her almost physically. A minute earlier, every glance in the room had felt like judgment turned outward at her. Now the judgment had changed direction. Daniel was the one exposed. Daniel was the one being seen clearly. Humiliation had moved houses. Ethan pulled out her chair fully, waited until she stepped free of the table, then took her coat from the hook with the kind of ease that belonged to men raised around quiet power. Yet there was nothing performative in him. No grin, no wink, no hunger for gratitude. Just a clean, decisive refusal to let the night get any uglier. They walked through the restaurant under 100 glances, past polished glass and candlelit faces, through the revolving door, and out into the cold Chicago air where the wind rushed at them off the lake, and Claire finally let out a breath she had been holding since Daniel first looked at her like a disappointment. For a moment neither of them spoke. Traffic hissed over wet pavement. A taxi horn sounded somewhere down the block. The restaurant's gold sign glowed behind them, expensive and indifferent. Their reflections flashed briefly in the revolving glass before vanishing back into the warm interior they had just left. Claire wrapped her coat tighter and gave a brittle laugh. That was humiliating. Ethan looked at her, really looked, and said, "No. What he did was humiliating. That is different." The words hit harder than Daniel's ever had because they gave her back something she had been losing inch by inch all evening. A line, a distinction, a way of understanding the moment that did not leave the cruelty lodged inside her identity. She swallowed, staring at the sidewalk. "You did not have to do that." "Yes," Ethan said, his gaze dropping briefly to the blue sketchbook peeking from her bag. "I did." Claire frowned, lifting her head. There was something in the way he said it, something too personal for a stranger, too certain for coincidence. And then, before she could stop herself, she asked, "Have we met before?" Ethan's mouth almost curved, as if he had been waiting years to hear that question. "Claire Bennett," he said softly, with the calm of someone opening a door she had forgotten existed. "You once lent me a pencil in room 214 and told me not to listen when people laughed." For a second Claire forgot the cold. Room 214. The number opened somewhere deep in her memory, like a light switching on in an old hallway, and suddenly she could see it again. The cracked beige walls of Lincoln High, the late afternoon sun slanting across scratched desks, a tall boy in the back corner keeping his head down while two louder boys made sport of his silence. She had been 17, carrying too many books and a pencil tucked behind her ear, and she remembered walking past his desk, setting that pencil beside his hand, and saying, almost without thinking, "You do not have to let people who are cruel decide who you are." Claire stared at the man in front of her now, this composed stranger with expensive shoes standing on a wet Chicago sidewalk like he had stepped out of another world. "Ethan," she said at last, and his name felt strange and familiar all at once. This time he smiled, small and real, nothing like the polished smile she imagined men in his orbit wore for magazines and boardrooms. "It took you a second in high school too," he said. Claire let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "You wore flannel shirts, sat in the back, and barely spoke to anyone. That is still an accurate review of my personality before coffee, Ethan said. The joke was so dry, so unexpected, that Claire actually laughed, and the sound surprised both of them. The tension in her shoulders eased by one careful inch. Snowmelt glistened along the curb. A bus rolled past, sending a gust of air against their coats. For the first time all evening, the city no longer felt like it was pushing her around. I cannot believe that was you, she said. You were the only person who was kind to me that semester, Ethan replied. That is not true. Claire looked down. I was just a girl with an extra pencil. No, he said quietly. You were a girl who noticed. The simplicity of it struck her harder than flattery ever could. Claire had spent so much of her adult life being overlooked that she had forgotten noticing could matter. Noticing was small. It was invisible. It left no plaque, no headline, no resume line. But sometimes it interrupted shame before it hardened into identity. Ethan glanced toward the restaurant behind them, then back at her with a seriousness that softened his face. Do you need me to call you a car? Claire shook her head. I take the red line. Ethan nodded as if that detail belonged in the category of facts worth respecting. Then I will walk you to the station. You really do not have to keep rescuing me. Claire, he said, and there was something steady in his voice that made her lift her eyes again. Walking someone 2 blocks in 30-degree weather is not rescuing them. It is basic decency. She should have argued. She should have thanked him politely and gone home alone with her pride gathered in both hands. Instead, she found herself falling into step beside him under the streetlights, her old blue sketchbook pressed against her side, while the man she had once known as the quiet boy in room 214 matched her pace exactly, as if somewhere between then and now he had learned power, but had never forgotten how loneliness felt. The walk to the station should have felt awkward, but it did not. Their shoes moved over damp pavement in the same unhurried rhythm, past dark storefronts and glowing hotel windows, while the city hummed around them with the restless energy of a Friday night. Claire kept waiting for Ethan to ask the kinds of questions people always asked when they wanted to sort her into a category fast. What do you do exactly? Are you still at that gallery? Why would a woman your age go on a blind date like that? But he did not. He only asked if she was still sketching, and when she looked up at him, surprised, he glanced lightly at the blue book tucked under her arm. You used to draw in the margins of everything, he said. History notes, chemistry worksheets, even the lunch menu once. Claire shook her head with a soft laugh. You remember that? I remember more than I should. She looked at him sidelong. That sounds slightly ominous. It only becomes ominous if I start quoting your handwriting. That made her laugh again, easier this time. They reached the station entrance just as a service alert flashed across the overhead sign. Delays on the red line. 22 minutes. Claire stared at it, then sighed. Of course. Ethan slipped his hands into the pockets of his coat and looked down the platform stairs where cold air rose from underground like a warning. There is a diner half a block over, he said. Bad coffee, excellent pie, warm seats. You can wait there instead of freezing down there. Claire hesitated. Somewhere inside her, the responsible part of her mind was listing reasons to say no. It was late. He was practically a stranger, even if he was not. She was still embarrassed, still off balance, still carrying the bruised remains of an evening she had hoped would make her feel less alone. But Ethan was standing there with the patience of someone offering shelter, not pressure. So 5 minutes later they were seated in a narrow booth under soft yellow lights, while a waitress with silver hair refilled ceramic mugs and called everyone honey like she had earned the right. Claire wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, letting the heat sink into her fingers. From there it came out in pieces she had not planned to say. The gallery had cut her hours 6 weeks earlier. Her landlord had posted a late notice yesterday. She was freelancing wherever she could, designing invitations, hand-lettering menus, restoring old frames for a dealer who always paid 2 weeks late. Sometimes she did small layout jobs for nonprofits that loved her work and had no money. Sometimes she lettered chalkboard menus for cafes that replaced them 3 days later when the specials changed. Some months, all those scattered pieces just barely became rent. And the blind date? Ethan asked gently. Claire gave a tired half-smile. My cousin meant well. Apparently, I need to be more strategic about my future. Ethan leaned back, studying her with a quiet intensity that did not feel like judgment. Strategic is overrated, he said. Most people use it when they mean self-serving. Claire looked out the diner window at the street, at the bus rolling past with fogged glass, at her own reflection faint in the pain. "I am just tired," she admitted. "Not dramatic movie tired. Real tired. The kind where you keep being decent because you do not know how to be anything else, and it still never seems to get you ahead." Ethan was silent for a moment. Then he said, with a calm certainty that made her throat tighten, "Being decent does not always make life easier, Claire. But it does make it worth trusting the people who still recognize it." The waitress brought pie they had not ordered. Ethan thanked her. Claire stared at the plate and almost laughed at the absurdity of the evening. Humiliation, memory, coffee. A man from high school reappearing like the city had hidden him for years just to return him at the exact moment she needed witness more than comfort. When he walked her the last 3 blocks to her building, he said nothing about the chipped front steps, the flickering hallway light, or the fact that the radiator on the second floor clanged loud enough to be heard from the street. He only noticed the little taped sign on her mailbox that read Bennett in neat hand lettering, and the stack of flat cardboard portfolios she carried upstairs like they mattered. To him, somehow they did. Claire slept badly, the kind of sleep that never fully lets you rest because your mind keeps circling the same impossible image. Ethan standing beneath the restaurant lights, calm as winter steel, saying her name like it had belonged somewhere in his memory all these years. By 8 the next morning she was up, hair twisted loosely back, standing in her small kitchen in wool socks while the radiator knocked like an old man clearing his throat. Outside her narrow window, Chicago wore a pale gray sky and dirty edges of snow pushed against the curb. Her apartment looked tired in the morning, but honest. A narrow table by the window, 2 mismatched mugs, stacks of paper, old museum postcards pinned to the wall, a thrift store lamp angled toward the desk where she usually worked. It was not glamorous, but it was hers, or close enough to hers that the thought of losing it had recently begun to feel like a personal failure rather than an economic fact. Claire checked her phone expecting the usual things, a bill reminder, a message from her cousin apologizing for Daniel, maybe another freelance client asking for revisions without offering more money. Instead, she found a professionally formatted email marked urgent. The Cinderline Red Coal Foundation Arts Initiative. For a long second, she thought it had to be spam. She opened it anyway. Asterisk Miss Bennett. We would like to invite you to a private interview this morning at 10:30 regarding a new community arts leadership project. Transportation is available upon request. Asterisk Claire read it 3 times, then a 4th, her heartbeat picking up with each pass. She had never applied to anything called the Coal Foundation Arts Initiative. In fact, the only thing she knew about it was that wealthy donors and city magazines liked to mention it whenever they wanted to sound generous. She almost deleted the message on instinct. Then her phone buzzed again. A second email. A parking pass, a visitor badge, and an address in River North that made her sit down at the edge of her bed. It was not just any office. It was the glass and stone headquarters of Coal Ventures, a building she had passed 100 times and never once imagined entering unless she was delivering wedding invitations to someone rich enough to forget she existed 5 minutes later. Claire stared at the screen, then at the blue sketchbook on her desk, then back again. By 10:20, she was standing in the lobby wearing her navy dress under a borrowed camel coat from her neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who had taken one look at the address and said, "Honey, go let the rich people be impressed for once." The lobby alone looked like another species of reality. Polished marble floors, a 20-foot living wall of green, elevators that opened without a sound, and a reception desk so sleek it seemed to float. Nothing clattered. Nothing hurried. Even the air felt expensive. Claire gave her name, bracing for confusion, but the woman at the desk smiled immediately. "Miss Bennett, we have been expecting you." Those 6 words did more to unsettle her than Daniel ever had. A man in a dark suit appeared, offered to escort her upstairs, and guided her into a private elevator lined with brushed brass and smoked glass. As the car rose, Claire caught a glimpse of her reflection, wide-eyed, one hand clutching her sketchbook like it was the last honest thing she owned. The elevator opened onto a quiet top floor washed in morning light, and there, across a long corridor of windows overlooking the Chicago River, was a massive digital screen displaying the face of Ethan Cole beside the words Founder and Chief Executive Officer. Claire stopped walking. The escort turned politely toward a pair of oak doors at the far end. "He is ready for you now," he said. And suddenly the man who had walked her through the cold, bought her bad coffee, and remembered a pencil from room 214 was no longer just Ethan. He was power. He was money. He was the kind of man cities made room for. And behind those doors, somehow, he was waiting for her. Claire stepped through the oak doors expecting something intimidating, something cold and polished and impossible, but Ethan's office was quieter than that. Sunlight spilled across wide plank floors and a long wall of glass overlooking the river. Yet the room itself held unexpected things. Shelves lined with architecture books worn at the corners, a framed black and white photo of downtown Chicago in winter, and on one side, a drafting table covered with sketches of buildings and public spaces. Ethan stood near the windows without his coat now, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, looking less like the untouchable face from the lobby screen and more like the man who had walked beside her in the cold the night before. Still, the scale of the room, the hush of the floor, the view alone reminded Claire that she was standing inside a world where decisions worth millions of dollars were made before lunch. "You should have told me," she said before she could stop herself. Ethan did not pretend not to understand. "That I owned the building?" Claire gave him a level look. "That you were Ethan Cole?" A flicker of regret crossed his face. "If I had led with that, you would have spent the entire walk home guarding every word. I wanted one honest conversation before the title got in the way." Claire could not decide whether that answer irritated her or relieved her. Maybe both. He gestured toward a sitting area near the windows, not to his desk, and when she sat he remained standing for a moment, as if he wanted to give the next words the respect of being said plainly. "I did not invite you here to save you, Claire." Her fingers tightened around the edge of her sketchbook. "Then why am I here?" Ethan reached for a folder on the table and placed it in front of her. Inside were photos of abandoned storefronts on the south side, vacant community rooms above libraries, and used corridors in old municipal buildings, all marked with notes and concept overlays. "Because I am funding a project that turns empty spaces into working studios and classrooms for adults who had to put their creative lives on hold to survive. Single parents, veterans, people rebuilding after layoffs, people who still have talent and no room to use it." Claire looked up slowly. Ethan's voice stayed even, but there was conviction in it now, something deeper than corporate language. "I have architects. I have donors. I have city approval halfway in motion. What I do not have is the right person to shape the heart of it." Claire stared at him. "And you think that is me?" Ethan nodded once. "Last night, a man insulted your clothes, your income, and your place in the room. You still thanked the server when she refilled your water. You still stood there with your dignity intact. This morning I had my team pull your freelance portfolio and the community workshop proposal you submitted to the Bennett Arts grant 3 years ago." Claire's breath caught. "That grant was never even shortlisted." "I know," Ethan said. "It should have been." She opened the folder wider and found, tucked behind the property photos, a clean scanned copy of one page from her old proposal, complete with her sketches for neighborhood art nights and low-cost public classes. Her own handwriting stared back at her like a version of herself she had almost let the world erase. Ethan finally sat across from her, his gaze steady. "I am not offering charity. I am offering leadership. Build this with me, Claire. Let me put the money behind what you already knew how to imagine." Claire did not say yes that morning because she was dazzled by the office or the view or the fact that Ethan Cole could turn one sentence into a door opening somewhere in the city. She said yes because when she looked down at the old proposal in her own handwriting, she saw the version of herself she had been trying not to bury under rent notices and freelance invoices. The weeks that followed moved with the strange speed of a life changing before she fully trusted it. 3 days later, she was walking through vacant storefronts with architects, measuring walls with a yellow tape measure, sketching floor plans on butcher paper spread across folding tables, arguing for wider workstations, softer lighting, and community bulletin boards instead of branded display screens. She argued for sinks that worked without leaking, for north-facing light in the painting room, for chairs sturdy enough to hold a tired adult after a 10-hour shift without making discomfort feel like a character test, for storage cubbies with names, because people took better care of spaces that made room for their belongings. Ethan never hovered. He showed up when he said he would, listened more than he spoke, and when donors or board members tried to reduce the project to public relations language, he would look to Claire and say, "She is leading design. Ask her." It was such a small sentence and such a radical gift that the first time he said it in a room full of executives, Claire almost forgot how to answer. By the second week, she stopped apologizing before sharing an idea. By the third, she was staying late in a converted warehouse office with her blue sketchbook open, coffee cooling beside her elbow, while Ethan reviewed budgets across from her and the city lights reflected in the windows behind him. Sometimes they talked about the project. Sometimes they talked about high school teachers, cheap cafeteria pizza, and how neither of them had become the people anyone predicted. Sometimes Ethan told stories in fragments, scholarships, impossible hours, investors who mistook quiet for uncertainty until they learned otherwise. Claire shared her own in smaller pieces. Her father leaving early, her mother teaching her to stretch paint supplies, the years when practicality won every argument against art. It would have been easy to call what was growing between them attraction, but it felt steadier than that, built from respect, from memory, from the way he always made room for her thoughts before offering his own. Which was why the article hurt as much as it did. It appeared on a Wednesday morning just after 8, posted by a glossy city gossip site that specialized in packaging cruelty as sophistication. The headline read, "From blind date disaster to corner office. How Ethan Cole's mystery woman landed a dream job." Beneath it was a blurred photo from the restaurant, Ethan standing beside her table, and another from the lobby of Cole Ventures, Claire clutching her sketchbook with startled eyes. The article called her a struggling artist plucked from obscurity by a billionaire with a savior complex. It suggested favoritism, whispered romance like a scandal, and quoted an anonymous source who claimed Ethan had been rearranging staff decisions at Claire's former gallery for weeks. Claire read the piece once at her desk, then again in the restroom with the door locked, her face burning so hot. She thought she might be sick. By noon, 2 donors had emailed asking whether her appointment had gone through a formal review process. By 1, an old coworker texted a screenshot with the message, "So this is how some people get ahead." Claire sat frozen, staring at the words until they blurred. Because that was the cruel genius of stories like this. They never had to prove much. They only had to activate a suspicion the world already preferred. A woman's talent was always one rumor away from being reframed as luck. One man away from being reinterpreted as access. When Ethan called, she let it ring. When he came to the project office himself, she was already standing by the long table with her coat on and her sketchbook shut. "Tell me it is not true," she said before he could speak. Ethan stopped a few feet away, reading her face with immediate alarm. "The article is distorted and invasive. My legal team is already handling it." "That is not what I asked." Her voice shook now, not with anger alone, but with the old humiliation returning in a sharper suit. "Did you contact my gallery? Did you lean on people? Did you clear the path before I even had a chance to walk it?" Ethan held her gaze for a long second. "I asked questions after that night. I wanted to know whether they had overlooked you. I did not hire you out of pity, Claire." But that was not a denial, and in the silence that followed, something inside her folded in on itself. She picked up her bag, then stopped, realizing her blue sketchbook was still lying on the table between them like an exposed heart. For one impossible second she thought about reaching back for it. Then she straightened her shoulders, left it where it was, and walked out before Ethan could see how much it cost her not to turn around. For 6 days Claire avoided every place in the city that carried Ethan's name. She ignored calls from the project office, silenced messages from numbers she did not recognize, and threw herself into small freelance jobs that paid too little and asked too much, because exhaustion was easier to manage than disappointment. At night, she would sit at her kitchen table with a cheap lamp burning over unpaid bills and feel the absence of her blue sketchbook like a missing pulse. It was ridiculous, she told herself, to grieve a notebook when what she had really lost was trust. Yet the two felt tangled together. The project had not only asked for her talent. It had asked her to believe that being seen and being respected could happen in the same room. On the 3rd day, she passed a bus shelter wrapped in a Cole Foundation campaign poster and had to physically turn her head away. On the 5th, Mrs. Alvarez found her reorganizing envelopes instead of opening them and said, "That man better either apologize properly or become a cautionary tale." Claire laughed, then cried. then hated that she had done both in the same kitchen. On the seventh morning, a messenger knocked on her apartment door and handed her a flat craft envelope with no company logo, no assistant, no polished explanation. Inside was her sketchbook, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, and beneath it a cream invitation embossed in understated silver. Cole Foundation Civic Renewal Gala. Thursday, 7 o'clock, at the Lakefront Exchange. Claire almost set it aside unopened, but a second card slipped free and landed on her table in Ethan's unmistakably precise handwriting. I was wrong to investigate your life before earning the right. I was not wrong about your work. The stage is yours if you want it. No pressure. No debt. Claire read the lines twice, then a third time, and what undid her was not the apology alone but the restraint inside it. No demand that she forgive him. No speech about good intentions. Just a man finally understanding that dignity could not be gifted from above. Thursday night arrived sharp and cold, the lake wind cutting across downtown hard enough to sting her eyes. Claire wore the same navy dress from the blind date, but this time she chose it for herself. Mrs. Alvarez clasped a simple silver chain around her neck and said, "Go remind them they were late, not you." The gala glittered with Chicago money and civic ambition, all tall glass, polished brass, camera flashes, and people who knew how to hold champagne like it was part of their education. Claire entered through the side of the grand hall with her sketchbook tucked under her arm and every instinct telling her to turn around. Then she saw the program screens. Not Ethan's face. Not Cole Venture's branding. A rendering of the first restored art space, warm brick, wide tables, community walls, and above it one line in clean white letters, designed and directed by Claire Bennett. She stopped walking. A woman from the event team approached and said, "Miss Bennett, Mr. Cole asked that you wait just off stage until your introduction." "My introduction to what?" Claire asked. Before the woman could answer, the lights dimmed and the room settled. Ethan stepped onto the stage in a dark suit. No theatrics, no practiced billionaire charm, just that same stillness he had carried into the restaurant on the worst night of her month. He thanked donors, acknowledged city partners, and then, in front of a room full of executives, trustees, reporters, and socialites, he said, "In the last week, there has been a great deal of commentary about this project and the woman leading it. Some of it has been careless. Some of it has been cruel. All of it has missed the point. This initiative does not exist because I rescued anyone. It exists because talent has been ignored in neighborhoods and in people for far too long. Tonight, you are not here to hear from me. You are here to hear from the person who built the heart of this work." His eyes found Claire at the edge of the curtain, but he did not come get her. He did not speak for her. He only stepped back from the microphone and made room. With her sketchbook held against her ribs and 200 wealthy strangers turning toward the darkened wing, Claire felt fear rise like a wave. Then she remembered room 214, a pencil set on an empty desk, a younger version of herself choosing kindness without witnesses. She lifted her chin, walked into the light, and this time when the city looked at her, she did not look away. Claire reached the microphone with her pulse beating so hard she could hear it over the silence. But once she opened her sketchbook and saw her own handwriting, the fear stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling like a door. She did not speak about scandal. She did not defend herself to people who had already decided they preferred gossip to truth. She spoke about the buildings she had walked past for years with dark windows and wasted rooms above them. She spoke about talented people working double shifts who still painted at midnight, about mothers who used grocery receipts as bookmarks in design books, about men laid off at 50 who still carved wood in garages because making something with their hands reminded them they were more than a paycheck. She spoke about dignity as infrastructure, about how a city did not become stronger because wealthy people funded beautiful spaces, but because ordinary people were finally invited inside them. She spoke about tables wide enough for collaboration, lighting soft enough to invite return, bulletin boards where opportunity could become visible without requiring polish first. She spoke about creativity not as luxury, but as a form of survival the world too often romanticized after first making it impossible. By the time she finished, the room was no longer politely attentive. It was still. Then it rose to its feet. Not all at once, not theatrically, but person by person, table by table, until the applause filled the hall with something warmer than approval. It sounded like recognition. Afterward, reporters tried to circle her. Donors asked for meetings. A trustee from a major museum told her the presentation had changed the way he thought about access and art. Claire answered what she wanted, declined what she did not, and for the first time in a very long time, every yes and every no belonged entirely to her. Across the room she caught sight of Daniel, invited as the guest of some finance executive who now looked embarrassed to be standing near him. He turned away before their eyes could meet. An hour later, Claire's former gallery director approached with a strained smile and an apology polished by panic, offering to discuss a senior curatorial role now that the city was clearly taking an interest in her work. Claire listened, then thanked her and said, with calm she had earned the hard way, that being noticed late was not the same as believing early. When the gala finally thinned and the lights softened, she stepped onto the terrace overlooking the black sweep of Lake Michigan and found Ethan there alone, hands in his coat pockets, giving her the kind of space that had become its own form of care. For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind carried the distant sound of traffic and the low silver shimmer of water beyond. The glass. You were right, Claire said at last. Ethan looked at her carefully. About what? You were wrong to investigate my life before I gave you the right. But you were not wrong about my work. Relief moved across his face so quietly that it almost hurt to witness. Claire, I am sorry. I know, she said. And I needed you to understand why it mattered. He nodded. I do now. She studied him. This man who could command rooms, but had finally learned that love and leadership were not the same as control. You stepped in that night because you remembered me, she said softly. Ethan shook his head. I stepped in because no one should be spoken to that way. I kept stepping in because I remembered who you were. There is a difference. A laugh escaped her, small and unsteady. There is. 3 months later, on a bright Saturday morning with the lake wind finally softened by spring, the first studio opened in a restored brick building on the south side. Sunlight poured through tall windows onto easels, work tables, sewing stations, and a community wall already filling with flyers and sketches. The room smelled like fresh paint, wood, coffee, and possibility. Neighbors drifted in carefully at first, then with more confidence once they realized no one at the door was measuring their clothes or credentials. Over the entrance, a modest brass plaque read Bennett House Arts Collective. Claire stood just inside the doorway greeting guests when Ethan walked toward her holding a narrow velvet box. Inside, resting on dark blue lining, was a simple yellow pencil capped in sterling silver. Room 214, he said. Claire looked up at him, her eyes bright. You kept it? No, he answered with a smile. I found one just like it and had it made to last longer. Some gifts deserve a better ending. She closed the box slowly, then reached for his hand in full daylight, in front of students, donors, neighbors, and children pinning drawings to the wall. You did not change my life that night, she said. You reminded me it was still mine. Ethan's fingers tightened gently around hers. And you reminded me what kind of man I wanted to become. This time, when the room looked at them, there was no pity in it, no spectacle, no misunderstanding. Only the simple truth of two people, standing side by side in a place built from kindness remembered, dignity restored, and love honest enough to make room for both. And for Claire, that was the real ending. Not that a powerful man noticed her. Not that a city finally applauded. Not even that the room once used to wound her had learned how to say her name with respect. It was that she had remained herself long enough to be found by the life that actually fit.